Greetings, everyone, and thank you for attending our webinar today, Getting Acquainted with Ignatius Sancho. My name is George Litterst. I'm speaking to you from a little town of Rehoboth, Massachusetts, a little south of Boston and a little east of Providence, Rhode Island. No matter whether you are attending live today or by video replay, I welcome you here. And for those who are here live, I invite you to enter the chat area of Zoom webinar and let me know who's here and where you're from. Thank you, Andrew from Canada. It's good to see you as always. We have a lot to cover today, and beyond putting some information, a greeting or so in the chat area, I would like to invite you to observe that we've got a Q&A button at the bottom of the Zoom window. And as the session progresses, if questions come to your mind, the Q&A area is the best place to post them. It goes into a separate window that I have access to that I can manage and dismiss questions once I've answered them and keep track of whether they've been answered or not without scrolling back through a whole list of comments. So I would invite you to use the Q&A for any questions. And greetings, Ratko from Germany. Thank you for attending today. So we have a lot to talk about. I would first like to get a few things out of the way. So I'm going to go back to my presentation slides. This session is sponsored by Time Warp Technologies. I am the president of Time Warp Technologies. It's a software company that produces SuperScore for the iPad. We're going to be using that application today in our exploration of the music of Ignatius Sancho. We're also the producers of Classroom Maestro, an interactive musical blackboard for music instruction for Mac and PC, Internet MIDI, an application for connecting any two MIDI instruments together over the internet using a Mac or PC, and Home Concert Extreme on Mac, PC, and iPad. It's an interactive MIDI file player. And I hope if you're excited by some of the things that I've presented today, that you'll look for further information at timewarptech.com. I do have a very extensive handout to provide to you today, and I will be putting that a little later into the chat area for you to download. So our topic is getting acquainted with Ignatius Sancho. And my acquaintance with him was really as a result of a larger movement that's taking place in the community of professional musicians and educators of the last few years, which is a growing interest in composers of the past who've been overlooked by the history books, essentially. And people have raised the question, well, haven't there been women composers of past era who wrote music of significance? And of course, the answer is yes, there are. And questions have been raised, well, what about people of non-European origin? And again, the answer to that question is yes, there have been. And so a lot of researchers have been digging into these nooks and crannies of music history and have been pulling out some very interesting music and interesting biographies of the people who wrote the music. And I heard about Ignatius Sancho a couple of years ago. There's a basic story about him, which I'll be presenting to you today, that essentially there's this gentleman who was born on a slave ship in the 1720s, is enslaved in England, and somehow becomes emancipated and is self-educated, is known as an adult, as a man of letters, and a well-known advocate for the abolition of slavery, and remarkably, a composer, and one who even wrote music for keyboard instruments, which is, of course, in my personal wheelhouse as a pianist and a piano teacher. And so I wondered, how is it that I haven't heard of this person? So I started to take a look into the music that he wrote and decided to focus on one of his 5 albums initially, the 12 country dances for the year 1779 set for harpsichord. Turns out that these are pieces that are beautifully playable on the modern piano as well. And the result of putting together a publication was that I really needed to take a deep dive into the history surrounding this person and the music that was written. I was not satisfied just to find original scores and work from there. I really wanted to know much more about him. So what we're going to be covering today is the following. Who is Ignatius Sancho, and why should we even care about this person? What music did he write? As examples of music that he wrote, we'll look in great detail at his 12 country dances for the year 1779, which are available in the original form in free locations on the internet, such as IMSLP, but also in an interactive urtext edition that I have published in the SuperScore app on the iPad that we will be using today. And then after presenting these 12 country dances, I'm going to circle back to the issue of the history of this man and when he wrote, and question some of the common wisdom about what we think we know of him. And I think you'll find that to be very interesting as well. And then I'll conclude by talking in a little bit more detail about one of the pieces, my favorite of these country dances, which has an extra musical story that I think is associated with it that I think you'll find interesting as well. And of course, there is this handout that I will be presenting to you. So let's dive right in. It's important to just establish in our minds some basic history about slavery in the 18th century, particularly in the English Empire. In the 18th century, slavery was legal, and the slave trade was also legal. In 1807, the slave trade itself was abolished, but not slavery itself. So it's kind of like saying, no, that was bad stuff. We shouldn't do that anymore. But, well, if you're already into it, you can keep the slaves you have, which, of course, to a modern way of thinking, that just seems quite bizarre, but that's historically what the case was. In 1833, slavery was abolished. However, there were a lot of nuances to that as well in terms of former slaves essentially become indentured servants to their former masters in the North and South American territories. But that's getting now beyond our topic for today. So apparently in the around 1800, there were quite a number of Black citizens in the London area. I became aware of a website that just came up, I think, in the last year. Myself, I became aware of it just in the last week, called Mapping Globalization. Ignatius Sancho's London, Recovering Black Communities in the 18th Century. And I've given a link to this website in the handout, but it's an immersive, interactive website for exploring some of the issues that we're going to be talking about today. And I've pulled this map out from it. The black dots are indicating clusters of Black residents in the London area. So right there in the center of the map is London, and that snaking object that's going across the map there is the Thames River. And apparently, amongst these 10 to 20,000 Black residents in London, there were citizens, there were slaves, soldiers who had fought in the American Revolution, sailors, free Black immigrants, and even some African royalty. And we're going to be focusing on this little cluster in the southeast area of London, which is known as Greenwich. And that's where we're going to find our Ignatius Sancho. Now, the world at large starts to become acquainted with Ignatius Sancho as a result of a publication that came out in 1783, 3 years after he died. It's the letters of the late Ignatius Sancho, an African, in 2 volumes, to which are prefixed memoirs of his life. So Ignatius Sancho was quite a prolific letter writer. And if you look through his letters, you'll find that there's a lot of mundane material in these letters, about, what he had to eat and what the weather was like and greetings from my wife and things like that. But there are also some very important letters that he wrote to very important people in British society, talking about the abolition of slavery and the importance of the movement and things of that nature. And a friend of Sancho's, Francis Crewe Phillips, basically went to quite a bit of effort, I think, to seek out the recipients of these letters and to put together this volume. And this book was financed by subscription. The first volume, which is shown here on the screen, is well over 300 pages. So there's a lot of material that was put together. Very prominent people in British society subscribed to this, and it was published and republished 5 times over a 20-year period. The memoirs, which is basically a little biography of Ignatius Sancho, is written by a man named Joseph Jekyll. And interestingly, Jekyll's name did not appear at all in this book until the 3rd printing. He was a lawyer, a fellow of the Royal Society, a member of Parliament for a period of time, and at one point was even the Solicitor General to the Prince of Wales. So one would think that a man of this kind of stature, writing just within 3 years of the death of the subject matter, Ignatius Sancho, would have contemporaneous information about Sancho and really do a good job that we could all rely on. And basically everybody's tried to rely on this history ever since. And so I'm going to start by telling you what Jekyll tells us in this history. For starters, in 1729, this was a period of the acquisition of slaves off the west coast of Africa and their export to various locations in northern and southern Americas. And according to Jekyll, Ignatius Sancho was born on a slave ship just within a few days of having left port on the western coast of Africa. And he said it was headed for the Spanish West Indies, ultimately landing in Cartagena, which is right here on the map. This is the northern coast of what today is considered to be Colombia. According to Jekyll, Ignatius Sancho was even baptized in that location by the local bishop. Now, how that comes to be, since he's a slave, I have no idea. That part of the story doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me, but it is part of the story, or perhaps legend. Jekyll tells us that they weren't there very long before his mother dies of some unspecified disease, and his father, totally distraught, thinking ahead to his future adult life as a perpetual slave, commits suicide. So what happens next? Jekyll tells us that a little over the age of 2, Sancho is brought to Greenwich, England. He is either sold or given to 3 unmarried sisters. Now, Jekyll doesn't inform us who these sisters were. If you do some research on the internet, you'll find that there was apparently a researcher named Anne Dinsdale who believes that she has figured out that these were the Ledge sisters, Barbara, Elizabeth, and Susan, possibly sisters of the Earl of Dartmouth. And I haven't been able to track down any more information about her source of this information, but surrounding information does seem to fit the picture in any case. So where these sisters were living was in this Greenwich area, which is southeast of London. And there's a section there called Black Heath. And fortunately for Ignatius Sancho, who, by the way, was named by the sisters Sancho, allegedly, according to Jekyll, because of a resemblance to the squire of Don Quixote. These sisters lived in Black Heath, which we'll see in just a moment, was a fortuitous location. Jekyll tells us, though, that these sisters tried to keep this young slave under control by keeping him uneducated, and that when he was getting out of control, would threaten him with a return to what's called African slavery, which was kind of a code for ship you back to the Americas, where you'd spend your time working the plantations for the rest of your life. But in this Blackheath area, not far from where these sisters lived, Jekyll tells us, was the home of the second Duke of Montague. And we see a picture from the past of that homestead. That home was occupied by the second Duke and the Duchess Mary Churchill. And it turns out that the Duke encountered this young Ignatius Sancho and was fascinated by him, observed, according to Jekyll, that he was unbroken at this point by his circumstance of being enslaved, and he challenged the boy to become educated, gave him books to read, and so forth. And how this literacy emerged, given the story that Jekyll gives us, is really a little hard to understand. He doesn't explain whether the Duke himself taught him to read or enabled him to spend time with one of the staff servants on the property who would teach him to read. It kind of runs counter to what Jekyll tells us about the three sisters who attempted to keep him uneducated. But we do know, since he did grow up to become a man of letters, he became quite well educated. And of course, he did learn to read. The Duke passes away in 1749. Jekyll's roughly 20 years old at that time. And shortly thereafter, and Jekyll, Ignatius Sancho is 20 years old, roughly at that time. And Jekyll tells us that Sancho fled the home of the three sisters, went to the Duchess Montague, and begged her to take him in. And prior to getting to the house of the Duchess, he took the little money he had, 5 shillings, went and bought a pistol and brought it with him and told the Duchess that if she wouldn't take him in and protect him, that he'd shoot himself. And according to Jekyll, she takes him in, and at this point, he somehow becomes emancipated. It's never explained in the story how this emancipation works, since slavery was legal in England. Did she buy him away from the sisters? Did they give him up in frustration because they couldn't control him? Were the Montagues so powerful they had some way of putting pressure on the sisters to give him up? This is just completely unexplained. So what happens next? Well, the Montagues own homes all over England, even up in Scotland. We see one here. But after being with the Montagues for just a couple years, the Duchess dies. And according to Jekyll, she leaves Sancho with 70 pounds and an annuity of 30 pounds. He goes off and lives a great life of freedom. He gambles his money away. He spends a lot of time pursuing women. He attempts to pursue a career as an actor, at which he fails. And then after having his wild time, he apparently comes back to the Montagues, which is now the home of the third Duke of Montague. We're not told exactly what year he returns, but at this point, he really kind of settles down. And according to Jekyll, he becomes very thrifty with his money, In 1758, he marries Anne Osborne, who is a young lady from the West Indies. In 1768, he's on a family trip because he's serving as a butler for the Montagues to a resort area. The Duchess has her portrait painted by the famous Thomas Gainsborough, and she has Sancho's portrait painted as well. And that's the image that you first saw in my presentation. We'll see it some more later on. In 1773, Sancho has to retire from domestic service due to gout, and he starts a grocery business. So now he's a man who owns property, which has some interesting implications for the rest of his life. And over this period of time that we're talking about, since having been married, he ends up fathering what used to be thought of as 7 children, but according to this website that's on your handout, some new research indicates that perhaps there were as many as 9 children. Now, that's the story that we've been given by Jekyll, and you can find summaries of this story all over the internet. We do have some actual documentation from this period to back up a number of facts about his life. We're looking right now at the screen of his marriage certificate of 1758. Now, all of his music compositions and the book that was put together of his letters refer to him simply as Ignatius Sancho, but here in the marriage certificate, we see him identified as Charles Ignatius Sancho, and he's marrying Anne Osborne. We do have a business card from his career as a grocer in the London area. On the front and on the back of the card, we can see indications that he's getting goods from the Americas that he sells in his grocery store. For some who've investigated the life of Ignatius Sancho, they've found this business card to be a little bit embarrassing in the sense that he's, although a passionate advocate for the abolition of slavery, and he's suffered under slavery himself, as a business person, given the way worldwide commerce works, goods from the product of slavery in the Americas does flow through his store. We have another interesting record about him. As a property owner, he was entitled to vote in parliamentary elections. And as far as we know, he is the first person of African descent to vote in a British parliamentary election. And the way elections were held back in those days, you didn't have a secret ballot. There was a big ballot that collated everybody's votes, and it was available for public examination. We see his name at the bottom, Ignatius Sancho from Charles Street, a grocer, and he's voted for 2 different individuals out of 3, one of which his name is Fox, which I understand was an abolitionist. One last historical tidbit about Charles Ignatius Sancho. As far as we know, he is the first person of African descent to have an obituary printed in a British newspaper of the time. And the Gazetteer published the following a day after his death. About 6 yesterday morning died suddenly Mr. Ignatius Sancho, grocer and tea dealer of Charles Street, Westminster, a man whose generosity and benevolence were far beyond his humble station. He was honored with the friendship of the late Reverend Mr. Sterne and several of the literati of the times. So indeed, although he did serve as a butler for a good bit of his life for the Montague family, he was treated in a very nice manner that enabled him to have a large community of friends and acquaintances at various stations of society. And we see correspondence with many of these people in the collected letters. Now, with all of this information that we know about Sancho, or think we know, particularly from the biography, none of it tells us anything about Sancho, the musician. Where did he get his musical training? How did he come about to be a composer? And those questions are actually essentially unanswered at this point in time. We do have record of 5 albums of music that he wrote. 1767, minuets, cotillions, country dances, scored for violin, mandolin, German flute, and harpsichord. 1769, a collection of new songs with lyrics by Shakespeare. 1770, cotillions, etc. Another in 1770, minuets, etc., for violin, mandolin, German flute, and harpsichord. And lastly, the collection that we'll be looking at today from 1779, a year before his death, 12 country dances for the year 1779, set for harpsichord. Now, before looking at this material, it's important to realize that there was a real importance in British society of country dancing that goes back into the 17th century. We're looking here at the cover of a book of dance tunes that any dancing master would have. This one, called The Dancing Master, produced by John Playford, went through 18 editions between 1651 and 1728. I realize this predates Ignatius Sancho himself, but I present it just as an example of this tradition of music making that encompassed really all strata of society, up into and including the nobility. So the music that's largely composed, except for the collection of songs by Ignatius Sancho, really fits this area of country dancing. And I have to imagine that based on his profession as a butler and a servant for a wealthy family, that somehow in his interaction with other staff at the Montague residences, he was rubbing shoulders constantly with musicians, and somewhere in there was his opportunity to become educated in the skills of playing an instrument such as the harpsichord, perhaps others, and for being able to understand harmony and write down his own tunes and harmonize them and even write out parts and so forth. The publications, such as this one, were published at his own expense, but then sold to the public. This particular one for 6, I'm not sure, shillings or pence there at the bottom. But it says here, it was done by permission, humbly dedicated to the Right Honorable Miss North by her most obedient servant, Ignatius Sancho, which is part of the flowery language of the time. So, these country dances in this collection divide themselves up into roughly half and half, compound time and simple time. For myself, I've subdivided them into some categories here. In 6/8 time, there's one piece that's especially easy, and I know many of you are teachers of young piano students, and you'll find these to be particularly interesting. So in the easy category, we have roughs and rees. In simple time, 2/4, Lord Dalkeith's reel is a fairly easy piece. But then we have some that are a little more challenging, but playable by an intermediate level keyboard player. Some perky ones in 6/8 time with titles such as The Royal Bishop, Culford Heath Camp, Bushy Park, Mungo's Delight. And in common time, Duchess of Devonshire's Reel, Lady Montague's Reel, Trip to Dillington, and then some more stately pieces, Lindred Lasses, Strawberries and Cream, and All of One Mind. Now, how significant these titles are, you would have to decide for yourself. Clearly, some of these pieces are intended to honor individuals that Sancho knew, such as the Duchess of Devonshire and Lady Mary Montague. Other ones are no doubt places that Sancho visited, such as Dillington and the Culford Heath Camp, Bushy Park, and so forth. And we're going to start by taking a look at the Duchess of Devonshire's reel. This is what the original publication looks like. The printing of music back at this time was a bit crude compared to modern standards, but it is written in a rather modern way for sure. And you'll notice that there's rather extensive commentary at the bottom, which are the dance steps. How should this music be danced? What do you do? And I can't actually read the whole thing. There's an abbreviation here that's CU period. I suspect that means couple, in which case this might be the first and second couple, foot it and half right and left, foot it and half right and left back again, crossover, two couples lead up the front foot, and so on. So it really takes a person who's an expert in the country dancing of this period to be able to decipher this. And you can find videos on the internet of groups that have studied this music, particularly, especially Ignatius, Sancho, and dance these tunes. And I'm about to show you one such. But first, let's take a look at this piece in SuperScore itself on the iPad. So I'm going to switch my screen sharing over to my iPad. When I publish these works, I do it in each one of the pieces in the album twice. Obviously, this is modern notation now, but you're looking at an urtext edition. In other words, you're only seeing what was printed in the original publication, the slurs that Sancho put in there. There aren't any fingerings, there aren't any dynamics. Of course, it was intended for the harpsichord, no tempo indications. This is the urtext. I also provide the same piece in an edited version with suggested fingerings and articulations to guide somebody in the performance. And I'll talk about that in just a moment. In order to not take up too much time with repeats, I'm going to start this on the second time through the first section. In the urtext, I record this on a harpsichord. And then, of course, it repeats some more. So that's the harpsichord version, and you could hear in there the articulation that I applied to the performance. If the whole thing was just played non-legato or legato for that matter, you'd find that it would lack the life that it needs to have. And for those of you who might be considering teaching this music to students, the thing that I would like to emphasize is that you really need to come up with an articulation scheme to make these pieces work. The scheme that I apply in each case isn't the ultimate scheme. There are other ways that one could decide to do these things. But once you've established that scheme, that does tend to dictate the fingering. And in various places, you are going to have a much easier time playing the piece if you realize, here's where I'm going to lift my hand and simply move to a new location, and the fingering would indicate that. I will play just a little bit of this, maybe just a little bit of the first section. as the piano performance now, just to give you a contrast. And you'll notice in terms of difficulty, it's roughly in the ballpark of some of the easier pieces, let's say from the Anna Magdalena Bach notebook. And they provide really nice opportunities to play some different literature than the standard literature that most of us teach most of the time. Now, going back to my slides for just a moment. Where did the slides go? Here we are. I want to tell you that in the handout, I call attention to a particular video that's available on YouTube from the early dance circle in England. And it's especially good in that there's a wide-ranging discussion specifically about Ignatius Sancho and his music and how it should be danced by virtue of the scholarship that they're applying. And then they have a number of examples. Now, most of both their examples on the internet as well as other ones that you might find from other groups, unfortunately, either have not very good recording of the audio or rather blurry video. But nonetheless, these recordings are informative and give us a sense of, well, how fast do the dancers actually move and what do their dancing tell us about how we might establish a tempo for the music. So I'm just going to show you one example from this. And this will be, again, the Duchess of Devonshire's Reel. So in the interest of time, unfortunately, I have to stop it at that point. But a couple of things that I'll note about it. The dancers were basically stepping 2 steps to the bar. So for them, this was as though it was in cut time. So you really feel like the music is moving along, but their steps don't actually proceed with great quickness, except where they take steps in between the bigger steps, and we see some of that as well. But they do interesting formations and so forth. And so I'd strongly encourage anybody who gets interested in this music to investigate the dancing examples that you can find on the internet. I think they're really very informative. So I've got a particular order in which I would like to show you these pieces. So we're going to take a look, starting with a piece that would be a very nice teaching piece from this collection. It's the easiest one. I'm going to be showing it to you in the my piano version here, and I'll try to shorten things by skipping over the first repeats here. So this is Ruffs and Rees. So getting the music in an interactive edition like this, particularly when the music is unfamiliar, it's very nice to have an embedded performance because it is a way to start to get the music into your ear and to make it your friend. We'll take a look now at another one of the easier ones. This is in simple time. This is Lord Dalkeith's Reel. And of course, there's a repeat. Now, if a student was learning this at home, I'd like to point out that there are a number of options. The student could, for example, say, I just want to practice the left hand and see if I can get that down. And you could, if you wish, turn off the playback of the left hand and even turn on an optional count in and then play along, and SuperScore would play the right hand. So imagine yourself playing the left hand right now. So, and you could, of course, reverse that and practice the right hand while SuperScore plays the left hand. If you decided that you can't keep up at that tempo, well, you can slow things down as much as you want. Let's take this for example. That's one of the advantages of the fact that we're in the MIDI world. These are MIDI performances. I did record them on an acoustic piano, but a piano that has MIDI capabilities, and so it generated a MIDI file. We've got a beautiful virtual piano embedded in SuperScore. You can hear it coming out of the iPad speaker, much as you are now over Zoom. But if you had a digital piano or an acoustic piano with a MIDI player system, it will play back on your piano. That's one of the options that you have. So let's take a look at one of these perkier pieces. Let's go and examine the Royal Bishop. And at this point, I'll point out that these pieces lend themselves, of course, to all kinds of different interpretations and even ensemble groupings. And you'll see some of this if you look for recordings on the internet. You could work with a piece like this with a violinist and a cellist, for example. And if you had dancers, you would be playing these 3 repeated sections as a group over and over again, because the dance is going to go on for quite a number of minutes. And so you can imagine, as a keyboard player, play the music as it's written the first time. Second time, the violinist plays the melody, cellist plays the bass line, and keyboard player could just play chords in a continuo style fashion to go along with that. Maybe the third time through, keyboard player play again as a soloist and ornament the melody line. Lots of possibilities, and one would expect that back in Sancho's time, a great deal of freedom would be applied to these pieces. Here is the trip to Dellington. And so forth. Let's take a look at this point at something a little bit more stately. At least I would interpret it as being a little more stately. This is the Lindrad Lasses. Couple more that are a little bit more on the stately side. We have Strawberries and Cream. and all of one mind. And just one more before we get to my favorite of the bunch. This is the Culford Heath Camp in Compound Time. So I said at the beginning that at some point we would circle back to the discussion of the history of Ignatius Sancho and maybe challenge some of the popular assumptions being those that come from his biographer, Mr. Jekyll. And so it's worth asking the question, for example, how do we know that Ignatius Sancho was born on a slave ship that was headed to what's now Colombia? Apparently, there's been a lot of research into slave ships and their trajectories and where they went. And at this point in the year 1779, nobody has been able, apparently, to identify a ship that fits this story. Now, of course, Jekyll could have been wrong about the year. How would he even have known the year 1729? I mean, if he had heard it from Ignatius Sancho himself, how would he, as an infant, have known what year it was and have had that? I mean, where would the information have come from, basically? So there's a lot of mystery about that. I'd already raised the question as to, is it possible that he was actually baptized by the bishop in Cartagena? Who knows? The story about his mother dying of a disease and his father committing suicide, again, one has to wonder, where would that information have come from? Somebody would have taken this 2-year-old from the Americas to England to provide to these 3 sisters as a slave. Would that person have brought this knowledge with him? In which case, why even bother communicating it? I mean, we're just talking about a slave here, somebody who's, we're not really dignifying with the way we would an unenslaved human being. I tend to suspect, and one of the writers that's mentioned in the handout that I'll be providing has suggested that there's a lot about the biography of Ignatius Sancho that sort of fits the abolitionist narrative and is very similar to other stories that were circulating in communities that were advocating for the abolition of slavery. And of course, there's no reason to think that that's a nefarious thing or a way of, deliberately trying to distort history or something like that. But when you're advocating for something, there is a tendency to try to drive your point home in the strongest possible terms that you can. And if there are any parts of the story that you can, make bigger than life to make your point, there's a natural tendency to do that. Now, I wouldn't be surprised if some of these stories, such as what happened to his mother and what happened to his father, were actually imposed upon him by his slave owners. You know, you're a worthless person. Your mother died of disease. She was weak. You're probably weak too. You know, your father didn't have any much courage and he committed suicide. I mean, these are things that you could use to try to break a young person and keep them down. So I wouldn't be surprised if there's some kind of thread to these stories, that they didn't just pop out of Mr. Jekyll's head and, you know, he put them down as a matter of fancy. But one has to wonder if we can really take them as literally as they have been presented. So in any case, I raise some of these challenges here just to suggest that if you get into the music of Ignatius Sancho, you're really getting into very fertile ground for all kinds of exploration about the bigger human issues that take place within which music arises and tries to elevate us to you know, being higher selves, and invites us to participate in this higher realm. And for students who would like to pursue these issues, again, Ignatius Sancho is one that has a lot of surrounding circumstances that are fascinating for investigation. And this brings me to the final piece that I want to play for you. It's my favorite in the set. You see it here on the left side on the iPad. It's called Mungo's Delight. Now, you can understand a title like Dillington, a trip to Dillington. Well, there's a place called Dillington, and he made a trip there, and he titled a piece after that. But what the heck is Mungo's Delight? And there are a couple of possibilities here. Apparently, Ignatius Sancho knew a guy named Julian Soubise. He was also of African descent, and he's shown here on the right side in a caricature called a Mungo macaroni. And the word Mungo is probably a pejorative describing somebody of color, is my guess. I haven't been able to identify too much association with that. A macaroni is basically a dandy, somebody who's just very flamboyant in the way they dress and present themselves. And apparently Julian Soubise was very much a macaroni. If you recall the American, what we think of as the American tune, Yankee Doodle went to town riding on a pony, stuck a feather in his cap and called it macaroni. Well, it was actually a British song, and British soldiers sang that song to make fun of the colonists, to think the colonists were so stupid that if they thought that they could put a feather in their cap, they would just instantly become a macaroni. Well, they were wrong about that. Strange things we learn sometimes when we study history a little bit. But in any case, Ignatius Sancho had some correspondence with Julian Soubise. And in the published letters, the way they're published, the names of the recipients are disguised, but some of them have been uncovered. And there is a letter in there from Sancho to Soubise. And he's basically saying to him, you know, look, you're like me. We've escaped slavery here, and we're really leading the good life. And we should present ourselves in a way that really shows appreciation for the things that we have, because there are many people like us who don't have what it is that we have. And so it's very possible that this man was the inspiration for this next piece. I also know that at this time in the late 60s, I think, there was a play called The Padlock. It was a play in which there's an old man who's keeping a woman under padlock, and there is a black servant, and the black servant's name is Mungo, and the owner of the slave is very demeaning, mistreats him and so forth, but he's a rascally guy, Mungo, and he has his ways of getting under the skin of his master. And so there's a a certain pugnaciousness about this character in the play, and that may play into this next piece as well. I don't know, but I'm going to show you the piece and tell you why it's my favorite in the set. All of the pieces in this set are in a major key. And in fact, this one ends in the key of B flat. So I guess we would say that this too is in a major key, but it starts in the relative minor. And in my playing of music of the 18th century, I know of all kinds of pieces in major keys that go to the relative minor and come back to major. I've played all kinds of pieces that were in minor, went to relative major and went back to minor. If they start in minor and end in major, it's typically in the parallel major, not the relative major. And so this one I've just been a little fascinated by, that it ends in the relative major, but it starts out minor. And it has a certain impishness about it, at least the way I articulate it here. And I'd like to play it for you. This is Mungo's Delight. So I hope you enjoyed that piece as much as I do. I just think it's a wonderful one. It's possibly one that has a more personal connection to the composer. I don't know for sure. That would just be mere speculation on my part. But I love that, starting off in the darker key and moving to a major key, ending with a brighter future at the end. And Frank here is asking in the Q&A, could Mungo be a reference to Saint Mungo, patron saint of Glasgow? Now that's an interesting question. I did not know that there was such. And that is something I will have to investigate. Thank you for bringing that to my attention. If you look up Mungo in the dictionary, even in the English dictionary, what you get is cloth made from recycled, woven, or felted material. Well, that doesn't seem to help us very much here. So this was an introduction to the music and the life and times of Ignatius Sancho. If you've found any of this to be fascinating, I hope you'll visit us at timewarptech.com, learn more about SuperScore and the wonderful publications that are available in SuperScore. SuperScore is a free download on the iPad from the App Store, and it comes with a bunch of sample files. And then when you're ready to buy some music, there's a shopping cart button, and you go to the store, and there are thousands of publications available from some major publishers like Hal Leonard and Carl Fisher and Boozy and Hawks, and from some smaller publishers who are nonetheless quite prolific, like Harbridge Publishing House in Canada and Piano Safari. Time Warp Technologies is also a publisher, and you will find the 12 country dances of the year 1779 under the publisher name Time Warp Technologies in the store. So thank you very much for coming today. And I see a couple of you put some comments here from Claire and Frank. I'm glad you enjoyed the presentation. I think these pieces are really delightful. Claire wants to know if there's going to be a recording of the webinar, and yes, it's being recorded automatically. I need to get it downloaded once it's all concluded and put tags at the beginning and the end, and then I will post it on the Time Warp Technologies website and on the SuperScore Facebook page. And as somebody who registered for this, you'll also get an email follow-up that will point you in the directions of these. So if there are any questions other than what's come up so far, I'd be happy to hang with you just a little bit. But in any case, I'll just tell you, as a piano teacher myself, I'm now starting to use some of these pieces with students and am having some good fun with them. So, well, I think we have found ourselves at the end of the session. I hope you will look for more sessions from me and from Time Warp Technologies, and look forward to seeing you again in cyberspace. Thank you again for coming. Take care.